What is your breaking point? That moment when love transforms into a cruel logic that says, the best way to love someone is to disappear from their life. Or the strength you always maintained becomes a devastating conviction that your presence is destroying a person who has become more important than your own happiness. There comes a specific moment when a person who has always been strong, who has survived death threats and constant terror with impressive resilience, decides that the greatest act of love is not to stay and fight, but to disappear silently, not because they no longer love, not because they are tired, or because fear has won, but because they love too much. Because they see with brutal clarity the destruction that their presence is causing in the life of the person who sacrificed everything for them. For her, that moment arrived on a Friday night, 6 weeks after the immediate threat had been neutralized. 6 weeks of watching Jake Dawson, the man who had become everything to her, who had protected not only her but the entire family she loved, who had risked his badge and career and reputation, built over 22 years' pay, an increasing price for choices he had made on her behalf. She saw through his office window, Jake sitting alone, surrounded by boxes of personal belongings he had begun packing. Reading an official letter with an envelope she instantly recognized, watching his shoulders slump under the weight of words she knew, without reading, were devastating. Extended suspension. Formal investigation for massive protocol violations. Possible career termination that completely defined his identity. And all because he had chosen to protect her in ways the system didn't approve of. Because he had moved her and her family without authorization. Because he had operated outside protocol, motivated not by duty but by love, which complicated the narrative of heroism and made him suspect. Stay with me until the end. Because what happened when she decided to leave to save him, and when he found out, will show you something fundamental about the difference between sacrifice that seems like love but is actually a way of denying another person's agency, and love that faces consequences together, even when it's difficult. Because she wasn't a coward. She wasn't running away out of fear or because she couldn't handle the pressure. She was trying to do what she believed to be the purest act of love possible, removing herself completely from his life, disappearing in ways that would force him to move on, giving him a chance to rebuild his career without her as an anchor or a constant reminder of everything he had sacrificed. It was logic that seemed flawless in the solitude of sleepless nights. Jake had had a stable life before she appeared, a respected career, a clear identity, a community that valued him, a predictable future. And now he had uncertainty, an investigation, colleagues avoiding him, murmurs about a recall, the real possibility of losing the badge he wore with pride. She was reason, not entirely the corruption he exposed, the organization he dismantled. All of that mattered. But the complication was their relationship, the fact that he had fallen in love with a witness he protected, that the line between duty and desire had been obliterated in ways that investigators characterized as compromised judgment. So she spent weeks meticulously planning her escape, not impulsively, but with the painful care of someone who knew she was making a devastating choice, but believed it to be morally necessary. She packed essential belongings in a hidden backpack. She wrote a letter explaining her decision without asking for forgiveness, because she wasn't asking for permission. She waited for the right moment when his absence would provide sufficient head start, and she maintained an emotional distance that he interpreted as natural trauma processing, but which was actually preparation for leaving, a gradual withdrawal designed to make his eventual absence less shocking, less painful. Jake noticed, of course. He noticed conversations becoming superficial, where they used to be deep. He noticed her avoiding casual touch, which had become second nature. He noticed guilt-ridden glances when he thought he wasn't watching. But he respected her space because forcing a confrontation when she clearly wasn't ready felt like a violation, because he trusted that she would eventually share what she was processing. Have you ever been through this? Have you ever loved someone so much that you figured the best way to love them was to disappear, to remove yourself so they could have a better life without you? Because it's logic that sounds noble on the surface, but completely ignores what another person wants, what they would choose if they had a say in the decision. Until Thursday night, when she finally decided to crack under the pressure of maintaining appearances. Lying in the room they shared in the house Jake was renting, knowing that in hours he would be leaving permanently. She tried to maintain composure until she could escape without a confrontation she knew she wouldn't have the emotional strength to maintain. But emotions betray even the most carefully laid plans. Something broke not dramatically, but quietly, devastatingly. She tried to suppress it, covering her mouth with a pillow, controlling her breathing, doing everything possible to cry. Silently, because she didn't want Jake to hear, didn't want to have to explain or justify or confront him until she was safe at a distance. But Jake showed up anyway because he heard through thin walls, despite her efforts to mask sound. Because he had developed over months a particular sensitivity to her pain. Because he recognized the specific quality of sobs she tried to suppress. Because even when he tried to give her the space he thought she needed, he couldn't ignore when she was suffering. In ways that cut through any consideration of appropriate boundaries. He opened the door quietly. He saw her face buried in the pillow, her body shaking as she struggled to hold back tears. Her packed backpack partially visible in the corner she had forgotten to hide completely. And he said nothing initially. He just sat on the edge of the bed, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, solid presence offering comfort without words, without pressure, just acknowledging that she wasn't alone, even when she tried to be. And that touch, that attention, when Jake had every right to be consumed by his own problems. When his career was crumbling and his future was uncertain, broke through the final resistance she had maintained for weeks. She turned, saw genuine concern on his face, without a trace of irritation or judgment or wariness of dealing with her emotional drama once again. And words she had been holding back gushed out in a desperate torrent, explaining why she had to leave. Why staying was selfish. Why she loved him too much to watch the destruction continue. And Jake, hearing that, finally understood what the distance of the last week really meant. Not processing trauma, preparing to let go. And he had to make a choice in real time. Let her go because her logic had a surface of nobility. Or fight to keep her, revealing truths she had been hiding for fear of pressuring her when she was vulnerable. But to fully grasp the magnitude of that choice, to understand why her attempt to leave was both an act of love and a devastating mistake, you need to know exactly what had happened in the 6 weeks since the threat was neutralized. What she had witnessed that convinced her that her presence was destroying Jake. And why that seemingly impeccable logic was actually a cruel way of denying him the choice he deserved to make. In the 6 weeks since the immediate threat was neutralized, since the criminal organization was dismantled and her family returned to Seattle, with safety restored, she should have felt immense relief, a sense that the nightmare was finally over. That life could begin to return to normal, even if normal was completely redefined by everything that had happened. But instead of relief, she felt a growing guilt that gnawed at her each day, that turned every small victory into a reminder of the cost Jake paid. At 32, she had survived weeks of terror that would have destroyed most people, witnessing a brutal execution, being hunted by professional assassins through 2 serious attempts that missed by inches and sheer luck. Having her family threatened in ways that revealed that individual strength has its limits when a predator attacks someone you love. She had survived through a resilience she didn't know she possessed, and, crucially, through Jake, who had become everything: protector, partner, the person she loved in ways that were frightening in their depth and intensity. But survival had come at a cost that was not hers, but his. And that cost was becoming unbearable to witness, day after day. Jake had lost the badge he had carried for 22 years, not permanently yet, but a suspension that had already lasted 6 weeks, with no clear sign of when if it would end. He was under formal investigation for massive protocol violations, moving a federal witness without authorization, using official resources for an unsanctioned operation, compromising the chain of custody, essentially operating a rogue operation that, even while exposing corruption, violated rules that existed for valid reasons. Colleagues who deeply respected him, who had worked alongside him for years, were divided in ways that created palpable tension every time Jake showed up at the precinct for investigation-related meetings. Some saw heroism in an officer willing to break rules to do the right thing, to protect the innocent when the system failed. Others saw unacceptable recklessness, a dangerous precedent where officers individually decide when to ignore protocol based on their own judgment, a compromise that could not be tolerated regardless of the outcome. The community that had elected him sheriff 6 years ago by a comfortable margin was murmuring about a recall, about whether a man who had violated rules so dramatically deserved to remain in a position of authority, even if an investigation eventually exonerated him of criminal wrongdoing. And the local media, which had initially treated the story as heroism against corruption, was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the relationship between Jake and her, about whether the line between protector and protected had been crossed inappropriately, about whether his judgment had been compromised by emotional involvement. If any of this has ever happened to you, if you've ever watched someone you love pay a high price for choices they made for you, if you've ever felt overwhelming guilt for being the reason someone's life fell apart, even when they didn't ask for sacrifice, share in the comments, because recognizing this pattern is the first step to understanding why their logic for leaving seemed so impeccable, but was fundamentally flawed. She saw it all: accumulated destruction, escalating costs, an uncertain future, and felt a responsibility that was overwhelming in weight and fundamental injustice. Because Jake had had a stable, respectable, predictable life before she came along. A career that defined him. A clear identity as a sheriff, whom the community trusted. A future he could map out with reasonable certainty. And now, uncertainty in every direction. An investigation that could result in termination. A relationship with her that complicated everything and made him a target of scrutiny and judgment. A real possibility of never returning to law enforcement, of having to rebuild his entire identity at 43. And for what purpose? To protect her. To make choices he believed to be morally necessary, but which the system characterized as violations. To love her in ways that transcended duty, but seemed suspicious when examined through the lens of formal investigation, looking for wrongdoing. She had become a burden, a weight, a complication, destroying the life of a man who, all he did, was do the right thing when the system failed. And the more she loved him, man, she loved him deeply, viscerally, in ways that went beyond gratitude to the territory of not being able to imagine a future without him. The more she recognized that true love sometimes means making devastating choices that hurt you in order to save the person you love. If this part resonated with you in any way, if you recognized this kind of distorted logic, where love transforms into the conviction that the best gift you can give is absence, leave a like so I know you're connected to this journey, because what she was planning wasn't cowardly abandonment or shirking responsibility. It was a sacrifice that seemed noble, that had the appearance of being the purest possible act of love. By removing herself completely, she would force Jake to move on, to rebuild without her as an anchor or a constant reminder of the mistakes he made while protecting her. It was logic he had carefully constructed over a week of planning. Without it, the investigation would eventually conclude. Jake could argue that his actions were motivated purely by duty, not personal commitment. The community would eventually forgive. His career could be rebuilt, even if not exactly as it was before. With it, relationships would always be complicated. Always evidence that his judgment was compromised. Always a reason to question his motives. So I had to go. Not because I wanted to every fiber of my being fought against the decision, but because I loved too much to be a constant reason for destruction. Because watching the person you love lose everything day after day while reassuring you that it was worth it in a tone that suggests they're Trying to convince themselves as much as you are is a form of torture that eventually becomes unbearable. And if you want to see more stories like this, stories about moments where love and logic collide in devastating ways, where a sacrifice that seems noble reveals itself as a way of denying the agency of the person you love, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because what Jake said when she finally revealed the plan, when she tearfully explained why she had to leave, will show you something fundamental about the difference between making choices for someone to save them and making impossible choices together, even when the cost is high. But before we get to that moment of confrontation, you need to understand exactly what she had witnessed that solidified her decision. The specific incident that transformed abstract guilt into the conviction that leaving was morally necessary, and how the week of emotional distance she maintained while planning her escape affected Jake in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a brutal difference between intellectually understanding that someone is paying a price for choices they made for you, and viscerally witnessing, day after day, week after week, the gradual erosion of everything that defined that person, knowing that you are the central reason even when they insist it was worth it. For her, those 6 weeks after the immediate threat was neutralized were devastating lessons in how guilt can transform from an abstract feeling into a concrete conviction that seems morally irrefutable, that the greatest act of love possible is to disappear. 6 weeks, 42 days since the criminal organization was dismantled through a coordinated operation that Jake had inadvertently catalyzed by exposing corruption. 42 days since Emily and Ethan returned to Seattle with sufficient safety restored that a relatively normal life was possible again, since the threat that had turned their 6-year-old nephew into a target was neutralized through arrests that dismantled the entire structure. 42 days that should have been marked by immense relief, by the feeling that the nightmare had finally ended, by gratitude for being alive and whole and able to rebuild. But instead of relief, she felt guilt that grew exponentially with each passing day, that corroded every moment of potential happiness, that turned small victories into reminders of the cost Jake had paid and continued to pay. At 32, she had survived weeks of terror that would have broken most people witnessing. The brutal execution of a man pleading for his life, being hunted by professional assassins through 2 serious attempts that failed by inches and fortuitous timing, not skill, having her family threatened in ways that revealed vulnerabilities that individual strength could not defend. She had survived through a resilience she didn't know she possessed. Ability to keep functioning under debilitating pressure, to maintain sanity when the world crumbled, to make impossible choices between bad options and worse. And crucially, she had survived through Jake, who had become everything, not just a protector, keeping her physical body safe, but a person who understood that her safety wasn't just physical, but emotional, who had expanded protection to include the family she loved, who had become a partner and ally, and eventually a person she loved in ways that completely transcended their origins as protector and protected. But survival had come at a devastating cost that was not hers but his. And that cost was becoming unbearable to witness as it accumulated day after day with no sign of diminishing or resolving. Jake had lost the badge he had proudly carried for 22 years, not permanently yet. Technically, it was suspension during investigation, not termination, but 6 weeks without clarity on when or if he would return. 6 weeks of professional identity being held in limbo. He was under formal investigation conducted by the Internal Affairs Department and overseeing federal agencies. An investigation that examined every decision he made from the moment he assumed her protection. Moving her without authorization to a cabin his family owned, using official resources for an unsanctioned operation, bringing Emily and Ethan in without proper coordination with other agencies, essentially operating a rogue operation that, while exposing significant corruption, violated virtually every established protocol. He faced a real possibility, not just theoretical but concrete, based on precedents from similar cases, of never returning to law enforcement. Of the investigation concluding that violations were so massive that termination was the only appropriate response, regardless of whether a positive outcome had exposed corruption, of having to completely rebuild his identity at 43 years old, when a career in law enforcement was literally the only thing he had done since 21. And colleagues who deeply respected him, who had worked alongside him for years and knew his character intimately, were divided in ways that created palpable social tension whenever Jake appeared in public or professional spaces. Some vocal but significant minorities saw clear heroism, an officer willing to sacrifice his career to do the right thing when the system repeatedly failed to protect an innocent person and her family from a threat that official protocols could not neutralize, to expose corruption that penetrated deeper than anyone had imagined. Others, possibly a silent but equally significant majority, saw unacceptable recklessness that could not be tolerated regardless of intentions or outcomes, a dangerous precedent where individual officers decide when to ignore protocol based on their own judgment, compromising a federal investigation through uncoordinated actions, an inappropriate relationship with a witness who was under their protection that raised questions about whether motivations were truly pure, or whether judgment was compromised by attraction or emotional involvement from the outset. The community that had elected him sheriff 6 years ago, with 82% of the vote, that had trusted him with certainty, that had seen him as an exemplar of integrity and competence, was now murmuring about a recall, not an organized movement yet, but conversations in cafes and council meetings, public questioning about whether a man who had violated rules so dramatically deserved to remain in any position of authority, even if an investigation eventually exonerated him of criminal wrongdoing. And the local media, which had initially covered the story as dramatic heroism against systemic corruption, was beginning to ask more uncomfortable questions, driven by an investigation revealing details: the relationship between Jake and her, the timeline of when it began, whether the line between protector and protected was crossed inappropriately, and whether his judgment was compromised by personal involvement that preceded questionable decisions he made. She saw it all: every newspaper article, every glance from Jake's former colleague, every conversation that abruptly stopped when Jake entered the room, every reassurance from him that everything is fine. The investigation will eventually conclude. The community will understand, delivered in a tone that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as she was, and she felt a responsibility that was overwhelming, not only in magnitude, but in fundamental injustice. Because Jake had lived a perfectly functioning life before she came along, witnessed a murder, and needed protection, which threw them together. A respected career that offered not only sustenance, but identity and purpose. Professional relationships built over 2 decades. A community that valued and trusted him. A future he could map out with reasonable certainty, continuing as sheriff, eventually retiring with a full pension, and the respect of all, living out the rest of his life knowing he had served well. And now, uncertainty in literally every direction. An investigation that could result not only in suspension, but in termination, and possibly criminal charges if the prosecutor decided the violations were serious enough. A relationship with her that complicated the narrative and made him suspect. A tarnished reputation, regardless of the outcome, because where there's smoke, there's fire. And because even a complete exoneration wouldn't erase the fact that he had massively violated protocol. A completely undefined future, because even if he technically kept his job, returning to work with colleagues who judged him or questioned his motivations would be untenable. She had become unintentionally, not through any malicious action, but unequivocally through simply existing and needing protection, a life-destroying burden on a man whose only fault was doing what he believed was morally necessary when the system failed. A burden he carried with repeated affirmations that it was worth it, and I would do it again. But with growing evidence in his eyes of accumulated cost, of exhaustion, not only physical, but existential, of having his identity constantly questioned. And the more she loved him with an intensity that was frightening, because she had never experienced that kind of connection. A love that wasn't based on gratitude or dependence, but on recognition of character revealed through impossible choices. The more she recognized the truth her mother had taught her through the example of sacrificing everything for her daughters. True love sometimes means making choices that destroy you to save the person you love. Especially when staying means helplessly watching as the person you love sacrifices everything, day after day, while their life crumbles specifically because of their connection to you, while the future they deserved is traded for uncertainty and pain because they chose you over their own safety. How can you continue to accept that sacrifice? How can you live with the guilt of being the reason everything fell apart? How does love survive when its foundation is the destruction of one person by another? Logic seemed cruel, but morally irrefutable, removing herself completely, disappearing in ways that would force Jake to move on without her as an anchor or complication, would give him a chance, perhaps his only chance, to rebuild. Without her, the investigation would eventually conclude that her actions were motivated by duty, not personal commitment. Without her, the community would eventually forgive and forget. Without her, Jake could have the future he deserved, instead of a future ruined by having loved her. It was a sacrifice that seemed noble, that bore all the marks of true love, putting his needs above her own desires, making a devastating choice, because the alternative was to watch the destruction continue. Loving enough to let go even when every fiber screamed to stay. But logic, however flawless it seemed in the solitude of nights processing guilt, failed to consider an absolutely crucial variable: what Jake wanted, what he would choose if he had agency in the decision, instead of having his future unilaterally decided by her, based on calculations that didn't include his voice. Comment below. This makes sense to me. When the guilt of being the reason someone's life falls apart transforms into the conviction that leaving is an act of love. The logic seems impeccable, but completely ignores what the person you're trying to save really wants. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a specific moment, not an abstract concept, but a visceral, concrete instant where guilt, that she had been building up through the gradual accumulation of evidence, crystallizes into an irreversible decision, where all rationalizations of, maybe it's not so bad, or maybe it will get better with time, evaporate in the face of the undeniable proof of destruction that her presence is causing. For her, that moment arrived on a Friday night, 6 weeks and 3 days after the threat was neutralized, when she witnessed through a window the truth that Jake had been meticulously hiding to spare her. The day had begun with family tension that had become the new normal, Jake preparing for a meeting at the police station, with the lawyer representing him during the investigation, discussions about next steps, about a likely timeline, about the increasingly clear reality that a return to law enforcement was unlikely even in the best-case scenario. She had offered to go along because she hated the idea of him facing this alone, of carrying the weight of potentially devastating news without immediate support. But when they arrived, when it became clear that her presence at the police station was causing obvious and palpable discomfort to Jake's colleagues who didn't know how to process the relationship between the suspended ex-sheriff and the witness he had protected in ways that were now under formal scrutiny, she stayed in the car. She sat in the parking lot trying to read the book she had brought but unable to focus. Her mind spinning with worries about what the lawyer was saying, about how bad the news would be, about how much more Jake would have to endure for having chosen her, when Jake didn't return after the hour the timeline he'd said the meeting would take, when growing worry outweighed the discomfort of entering a space where she clearly wasn't welcome. She got out of her car and walked through the police station entrance, trying to appear confident even as every passing officer's glance suggested they recognized her and judged her presence. She found his office through a memory from a previous visit, a hallway on the second floor, third door on the left, the sign still saying, Sheriff Dawson, even though the title was suspended. And she stopped at the threshold, not going in, because what she saw through the glass window in the door completely froze her. Jake sat alone in the office chair he'd occupied for 6 years, head in his hands in a posture of utter defeat she'd never seen him assume. Surrounded by half-full cardboard boxes of personal belongings, he'd begun packing framed photos, certificates, memorabilia from 2 decades in law enforcement, and, in his hands, a letter on official paper that she instantly recognized from the envelope with the Human Resources Department stamp discarded on the table. The kind of correspondence that never, ever brings good news. He didn't enter. He didn't knock. He merely watched through the glass, an invisible witness to a moment he clearly thought was private. As he read the letter, as he watched his shoulders that had carried so much, that he had seen remain straight under impossible pressure bend under the weight of words on the page, as his expression shifted from the tense hope he had held for the past few weeks to the devastated resignation of someone receiving news he had feared but hoped to avoid. And he knew without having to read a letter or ask or have explicit confirmation that the news was catastrophically bad. Not suspension is being reviewed or investigation is progressing well. It was suspension extended indefinitely, or a recommendation for termination has been submitted, or we see no way for a return to the position. It was the end, formally or effectively, of a career that had defined his identity for 22 years. She stepped back before he looked up and saw her there. Before he had to confront the fact that he had witnessed a moment of vulnerability that he clearly wanted to process alone. She went back to the car, sat in silence, processing what she had seen, waiting for him to appear with the composure he knew he would rebuild before leaving the office, because that's what Jake did. Carried weight alone, maintained a facade of strength to protect others even when he was broken. 20 minutes later he appeared, walking through the parking lot, with steps that were too controlled to be natural, an expression that was too neutral to be genuine. He got into his car, offered a small smile that didn't even remotely reach her eyes, and when she asked in a carefully casual voice, "How did it go?" he replied with a gentle lie designed to spare her, "The process is underway. The investigation takes time. The lawyer thinks it will take a few more months, but is confident. I'm prepared for any outcome." The right words, an almost convincing tone. But she had seen truth through that window. Devastation he hid the moment he knew she was watching. A burden he carried alone, specifically so as not to burden her further. The resignation of someone who had lost a battle but pretended to still be fighting so as not to worry others. And that image, Jake, alone, broken by the choices he made, protecting her, silently carrying the destruction of his life so as not to add guilt to hers, came a loop, obsessively repeating in her mind. She couldn't unsee it. She couldn't unknow it. Every time she looked at him in the following days and saw a smile he tried to make seem genuine. Every time he reassured her that it was worth it and he would do it again. But his tone had a subtle quality of trying to convince himself as much as she did. Of repeating a mantra because the alternative, admitting regret, would be intolerable. Every time they went out in public and his colleagues saw them, encounters that would have once been warm became awkward, with some avoiding him completely and others offering sympathy that seemed more like pity. Every time someone in the community that had elected him looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and judgment, processing through the lens of newspaper articles and rumors what had really happened, whether heroism was real or if there was something more sordid beneath the surface. She was the reason. Not the only reason. The criminal organization he exposed, the corruption he dismantled, all of that mattered and had independent value. But the complication, the element that transformed the clean narrative of heroism into something questionable, was her. A witness he chose to protect through unauthorized methods. A relationship they had developed that made investigators question whether his motivations from the beginning were pure or compromised by attraction or emotional involvement. And the more he saw the accumulated destruction, not improving but worsening, not resolving but deepening, the more he recognized with brutal clarity that staying was fundamental selfishness. He was keeping himself bound to the person who represented the end of everything he had built, who made reconstruction impossible because every attempt to move forward would be anchored by her presence, by the constant reminder that he had sacrificed his career for love, for a relationship that would always be complicated and suspicious in the eyes of others. Logic was cruel, painful to consider, but it seemed morally inescapable. The only way. Jake had a real chance at the future he deserved, a chance for the investigation to eventually conclude favorably when their relationship didn't complicate the narrative. A chance for the community to forgive and forget when she wasn't present as a constant reminder. A chance to rebuild his identity without her as an anchor. Was if he removed herself completely from his life. Not a gradual reduction of contact. Not let's give each other space. But a complete, definitive disappearance. Of forms that would force him to move on without residual guilt, or perceived obligation, or temptation to choose her over the rebuilding he desperately needed. Leaving without warning so he wouldn't have the opportunity to persuade her to stay. Leaving no contact information so he couldn't find her. With a letter explaining his decision, but not asking for forgiveness because he wasn't asking permission to do what he believed was morally necessary. It wouldn't be a brutal understatement, given that the idea of leaving Jake, of never seeing him again, of living the rest of my life without the person who had become more important than anyone else, caused physical pain that made it difficult to breathe when I seriously contemplated it. It would be devastating because I loved him in ways I didn't have adequate words to articulate. Love that transcended gratitude for protection or dependence born of trauma into the territory of recognizing a soulmate, a partner, the person I wanted to build a future with. But true love, she had learned through observing a mother who sacrificed relationships, career opportunities, and personal dreams to raise 2 daughters alone. Sometimes means making an impossible choice that destroys you emotionally too. Save a loved one from greater destruction. And saving Jake from the ongoing and escalating consequences of having loved her. Of having chosen her over career and distinction and community approval, seemed the only way to repay the monumental sacrifice he had made. The only way for love to be anything more than a burden that gradually consumed his life. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a specific terror that comes not from an external threat that you can combat with training, weapons, and tactics, but from feeling the person you love gradually, systematically, distancing themselves with a determination that suggests a decision has already been made, and having no obvious way to stop it without violating the boundaries or trust that a relationship requires. For Jake, that terror had begun subtly, a week after the moment at the police station, when she had seen him through the window, and had grown exponentially each day since then, until it became the horrifying certainty that she was planning to leave. Jake knew something was fundamentally wrong. 6 weeks after the immediate threat was neutralized, after the criminal organization was dismantled through an operation he had inadvertently capitalized, it should be a difficult period, complicated by a formal investigation hanging over him like a sword of Damocles, by the temporary loss of a badge he had carried for 22 years, by uncertainty about his professional future, but navigable with her by his side. Because they had become partners during a crisis, because they had chosen to face the impossible together. Because the love they declared was not based on convenience, but on recognition of character. Revealed through choices when the stakes were highest. But the last 7 days, the week since Friday, when he received the letter extending his suspension indefinitely, a letter he had read in the privacy of his office, unaware that she had seen it through the window, had brought about a change in her that Jake recognized instantly, and that terrified him in ways that physical danger never, ever had. It wasn't an obvious or dramatic change that outsiders would notice. It was a subtle but systematic withdrawal that only someone who knew him intimately would recognize. A deliberate emotional distance being created gradually, consistently, disguised under reasonable justifications of giving each other space or processing trauma individually before being able to be truly present. She, who had become a genuine partner during the crisis, who fought alongside him, who actively contributed to his safety instead of being passively protected, who declared her love in a moment of absolute vulnerability when both could have died, was withdrawing back to something that seemed dangerously close to witnessing while maintaining an appropriate distance from the officer who protected her. Conversations that used to be deep, sharing fears and hopes and vulnerabilities that genuine intimacy requires had become superficial, limited to the logistics of the day or observations about the news or any topic that avoided real emotional territory. When Jake tried to delve deeper, tried to ask what she was really thinking or feeling, she would deflect with a skill that suggested practice. "I'm fine. Just processing," or "I need time to think," or "let's talk about it later," where later never came. Physical contact, the casual touch that had become second nature during weeks of living in constant proximity, the nonverbal language of affection upon which a healthy relationship depends, was systematically avoided or cut short in ways that were clearly intentional, not accidental. When Jake reached out to hold her hand, she would accept it for a moment before finding an excuse to pull away. When they sat together, she maintained a small but significant physical distance. Hugs were rare, and when they did happen, they had a formal quality rather than an intimate one. Crucially, devastatingly, when she looked at Jimin, those moments when she thought he wasn't watching, when her guard was even slightly lowered, there was an expression in her eyes that Jake instantly recognized from years working with trauma victims. Guilt. Not guilt for having done something wrong, not guilt for personal moral failing, but guilt of a more insidious and destructive kind. Guilt for believing that her own existence was causing harm to others, that her presence was a burden, that the best thing she could do was disappear. Jake had tried to approach her directly multiple times throughout that week. Each attempt masterfully countered in a way that suggested she had prepared answers. "What's wrong? You've changed. I feel you pulling away." And she, "I'm fine, Jake, just tired. Everything that happened is finally catching up with me, now that the danger has passed." It's normal. Technically true, but not entirely true. Evasion disguised as honesty. The investigation isn't your fault. The choices I made were mine. I don't regret them. A reassurance she offered repeatedly, variations on the same theme. And she, "I know. And I appreciate everything you've done. I just need to process it at my own pace." The right words, but delivered with a distance that suggested she was thanking a stranger, not a partner. "I love you. That hasn't changed. Whatever you're going through, we can face it together." Vulnerability offered, hoping to be reciprocated. And she, "I love you too. But sometimes love means giving space. Trust me." Gentle manipulation transforming his concern into a failure to trust him enough. They were gentle lies that he recognized, but couldn't penetrate without forcing a confrontation when she clearly wasn't ready. Without violating the trust and autonomy that a healthy relationship demanded respecting. Even when instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong and that waiting was dangerous. At 43, after 22 years in law enforcement that included literally decades facing physical danger, Jake had substantial experience with fear. He'd had guns pointed at his face more times than he could count. He'd been in hostage situations where miscalculation would mean innocent deaths. He'd faced violent confrontations where a second of hesitation could be fatal. He'd developed the ability to operate under extreme pressure, to make tactical decisions when adrenaline was high and time was limited, to remain calm when others panicked. But nothing in 2 decades of professional experience had prepared me for the specific, paralyzing terror of feeling the person I loved drifting away, not out of anger or because they had stopped loving me, but because they loved me too much and had tragically miscalculated that leaving was an act of love. That disappearing from his life was a gift instead of punishment. that self-sacrifice was a way of saving him from the consequences of having loved her. And Jake recognized the pattern because he had seen it in countless trauma victims throughout his career. A distorted logic born of guilt, where they try to protect others by removing themselves from the equation, where they dramatically undervalue their own worth and massively overestimate the burden they represent, where love transforms into a self-destructive conviction that absence is the gift they can give. I had seen wives of abusers leave not because they didn't love their husbands, but because they believed they provoked the violence and that leaving would protect them. I had seen witnesses refuse to cooperate, not out of their own fear, but out of fear of retaliation against their families. I had seen trauma survivors isolate themselves because they believed their pain contaminated others. I had always intervened professionally, trying to show that logic was flawed, that their value transcended any perceived burden. But it had never been personal before. It had never been someone he loved. Processing through that destructive logic, and the difference between intervening as a trained officer and intervening as an emotionally invested partner was vast, because pushing too hard risked pushing her away faster, but doing nothing meant passively watching as she built a mental case to leave. So he kept watch, attentively but trying not to be intrusive, observing signs that confirmed his growing fear. The way she organized her belongings with suspicious efficiency, how she checked bus routes on her laptop when she thought he wasn't looking, how she wrote something in a notebook that she quickly hid when he entered the room, how she said goodbye to her neighbor in a way that seemed more final than casual. She was preparing, planning, and Jake was preparing for the inevitable moment when she would make a decision and try to execute it, when he would have to intervene in ways that respected her agency but also prevented her from making a mistake that they would both regret for the rest of their separate lives. Because losing his badge, however devastating it was a material thing that he could eventually process and rebuild around. It was professional identity, not complete identity. It was a career, not a whole life. It hurt deeply, but it was survivable with time and effort, and eventually a new direction. But to lose her, that would be a loss that could not be recovered. A void that no future career or restored badge could fill. The end of a possible future that he had begun to imagine, where the badge was a part but not the whole. Where identity included not only sheriff but partner, and eventually, possibly more. And Jake wasn't willing to let that happen without a fight. Without making her understand a fundamental truth that guilt had obscured. She wasn't a burden or a problem or a complication destroying his life. She was the reason his life had meaning that transcended badge status. She was the person who had reminded him that there was more to life than just work. She was the choice he would make countless times, even knowing the full cost, because the alternative life without her, a life where he followed protocol and kept his badge but lost his humanity in the process, would be an empty victory that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Comment below. This makes sense to me. When you recognize that the person you love is preparing to leave to save you, and you have to decide between respecting their decision or intervening by revealing a truth that goes against the logic they've constructed. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a devastating difference between planning something in the solitude of one's own thoughts, where logic seems impeccable, and executing that plan when emotional reality collides with careful rationalization. When the body betrays the mind through tears it can't suppress. When the person you're trying to leave shows up exactly when your defenses are lowest and forces you to confront not only the decision, but the motivation behind it. For her, that moment of collision arrived on a Thursday night, when everything she had meticulously planned crumbled. In the face of Jake's mere presence and the impossibility of maintaining a facade when she was completely shattered. The confrontation he had tried to avoid, the one he had planned his entire escape strategy around, came on a Thursday night, 6 weeks and 6 days after the immediate threat was neutralized. 8 days after seeing Jake through the window, reading a letter extending his suspension. 7 days after meticulously planning his departure with the agonizing pain of someone who knows they are making a devastating choice, but believes it to be morally necessary. Jake had left that afternoon for yet another meeting with his lawyer, a discussion about an investigation timeline that seemed to stretch indefinitely, about next steps that seemed increasingly limited, about a likely reality that they both recognized but that Jake still tried to deny, that a return to law enforcement was becoming less and less possible, no matter how the investigation concluded, because trust was broken, reputation was tarnished. The community had decided that he had crossed the line, even if technically he hadn't broken any law. She had taken advantage of his absence-free hours, when he would be busy with his lawyer, and then probably processing the case alone, because that's what he did, carrying the burden in privacy, before returning with his composure restored to make final preparations. She packed essential belongings into a backpack she had discreetly bought the previous week, enough clothes for weeks, important documents, money she had saved, a prepaid phone that couldn't be tracked. She left behind everything that wasn't absolutely necessary, because the point wasn't comfort but escape. And she wrote a letter, the final version, after multiple destroyed drafts, because finding the right words to explain the inexplicable why she was leaving when she loved him, why love was a reason to leave, not a reason to stay, was impossible, but necessary. It wasn't an excuse because she wasn't asking for forgiveness for doing what she believed was right. It wasn't a plea for understanding because she knew he wouldn't understand, that he would see it as betrayal, not sacrifice. It was an explanation, as honest as she could articulate, that she loved him too much to watch the destruction continue day after day, that he deserved a chance to rebuild without her as an anchor and complication, that her presence was costing him everything he had built, and that removing her was the only way to repay the sacrifice he had made. She planned to leave in the early hours of the morning, 3 or 4 in the morning, when sleep is deepest, when the city is quietest, when she would have several hours of head start before he woke up and discovered her absence and letter. Avoiding confrontation, which she knew with absolute certainty she wouldn't have the emotional strength to maintain. She resolved through it, because if she saw pain in his eyes, if she heard his voice begging her to stay, the resistance she had carefully built up through weeks of distance would crumble, and she would stay for the wrong reasons. Not because it was right, but because it was easier. Not because it served his well-being, but because it served her own need not to be alone. But emotions have a cruel way of betraying even the most practical and meticulous plans. That night, when Jake returned from a meeting with his lawyer, with an expression that confirmed the news wasn't good, when they dined in the tense silence that had become normal, when he retired to the living room, saying he needed to review documents, she went to her room, lay down on the bed, trying to rest before her planned escape in hours. Lying in the darkness of the temporary room they shared in the modest house Jake was renting after leaving cabin, he couldn't return there because the location was now under investigation. He couldn't keep it because he was financially strapped without a salary, trying to maintain composure, even knowing that in a few hours, she would be leaving permanently, that she would never see him again, that she was choosing solitude for the rest of her life to give him a chance at a better future. And something broke. Not dramatically with violent sobs that would have been impossible to hide, but quietly, internally. A crack that had been growing through an entire week of distancing finally shattered completely under the pressure of finality, of the recognition that she was really doing this, that in hours she would be leaving and could never return because returning would be admitting that sacrifice was pointless. She tried desperately to suppress it, covering her mouth with a pillow to muffle the sound, controlling her breathing with a technique nurses learned to stay calm in emergencies, literally doing everything possible to cry silently because she didn't want Jake hearing through the thin wall separating her bedroom from the living room. She didn't want to have to explain or lie or confront him before she was safely at a distance. She wanted to hold out until morning, when she could execute her plan and escape without having to face immediate emotional consequences. When the letter could speak for her and she would be too far away to be persuaded to return. But her body, betrayed her intention, sobs escaping even through her pillow, her breathing becoming erratic despite efforts to control it. A small but distinctive sound in the quiet of the house at night, and Jake appeared. Not immediately, took perhaps 10 minutes of her crying before the door opened, quietly but inevitably, because he had heard through a wall that wasn't as thin as she expected, or he was more attentive than she calculated, because he had developed over months of living in constant proximity, a particular sensitivity to specific sounds of her pain, because he recognized the quality of sobs she tried to suppress as coming from a deep, not superficial, place. Because even when I was trying to give her the space I thought she needed, even when I had monumental problems of my own to process, I couldn't ignore when she was suffering in ways that cut through considerations of appropriate boundaries or convenient timing. He opened the bedroom door without knocking urgency, overcoming courtesy, and saw her in the dim light illuminated only by a hallway light, her face buried in the pillow, her body shaking with the effort to contain sobs that were failing, and crucially, devastatingly, her packed backpack visible in the corner, a backpack she had completely forgotten to hide, or that her subconscious wanted him to discover. Irrefutable evidence of a plan she had denied existed throughout a week of evasions. He said nothing initially, because words seemed inadequate, because presence was what the situation demanded, not interrogation or accusation. He simply walked across the room, sat on the edge of the bed near her but not completely invading her space, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, touch offering solid and comforting presence, not pressure or demands, saying without words, "I'm here, you're not alone, you can break down without judgment." And that touch, that attention, when Jake literally had every right to be consumed by his own problems, an investigation with no end in sight, a career that was crumbling, a future that was uncertain in every direction, but who still chose to be there for her pain, broke through the final resistance she had maintained through practical preparations. She turned, looked at him through tears she could no longer control. Saw not irritation at being interrupted or judgment for weakness, but genuine concern, mixed with devastating understanding. He knew, obviously knew, what backpack meant, what the plan was. In words she had been holding back all week, gushed out in a desperate torrent. "I can't do this anymore. Jake, I can't watch you lose everything because of me, day after day. The badge you wore with pride, the career you meticulously built over 22 years, the respect of the community that elected you, your entire identity as sheriffs, all crumbling, specifically because you chose to protect me in ways that the system characterized as violations." Breathing quickens, bordering on panic, but forcing words nonetheless. "And I know you keep saying it was worth it, that you'd do it again, that you don't regret it. But I see the real cost in your eyes when you think I'm not watching. I see how it hurts every day that the investigation remains unresolved. I see how colleagues who once respected you now avoid you, or offer sympathy that feels more like pity. So I need to go. I need to remove myself completely from your life so you have a chance, sure only chance, to rebuild. Without me as a constant reminder of everything you sacrificed. Without a complicated relationship that worsened the investigation. Do you think leaving will save me?" Jake's voice was calm, controlled in a way that suggested intense emotion being maintained through willpower, not an absence of feeling. "Do you really believe that rebuilding my career without you would be a victory instead of a defeat? That a life without the person I love would be a success? I think you deserve a chance to have your life back," she insisted, her voice rising in despair. "Without the burden of me. Without the complications of a relationship born in problematic circumstances. Without someone who represents the end of everything you've built over 2 decades. You are not a burden. Firm, unequivocal, leaving no room for argument. And it doesn't represent the end of anything. It represents the beginning of finally understanding that life is more than a badge, that identity shouldn't be just about work, that there are things, people that matter more than career or approval or anything else external. He moved to cup her face gently but firmly with both hands, forcing her to stop, avoid, and look directly at him. "You're not a case that was my job to protect. You're not an assigned responsibility or an inconvenient complication. You're someone I love in ways that completely transcend duty or professional obligation. You're a choice I make consciously, a choice I would make knowing the full cost, a choice I make again every day when I wake up and decide that you matter infinitely more than badge or career or the approval of people who don't understand." And in that dark room, with her crumbling under the accumulated weight of a week of guilt and him holding up the pieces literally and metaphorically with the patience he had repeatedly demonstrated over the months, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of her. He understood that leaving would not be an act of love, but of cowardice disguised as sacrifice, that the unilateral decision to save him completely denied him the agency to choose his own future. That true love is not about making decisions for someone to protect them, but about making impossible choices together, even when difficult and painful. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a cruel irony in how a moment of emotional breakthrough, when you finally break through destructive logic and reconnect with the person you love, when you decide to stay and face the consequences together instead of running away alone, can be immediately followed by a brutal reminder that the outside world doesn't pause to allow you to process personal epiphanies, that a danger you thought was neutralized had only been waiting for a vulnerable moment to resurface. For them, that reminder came the next morning through a message that was both a threat and a demonstration of how exposed they truly were. But this moment of profound emotional reconnection, her finally understanding that leaving would be cowardice, not love, Jake revealing that she wasn't a burden but a choice he consciously made each day. Both agreeing that they would face an uncertain future together instead of apart, was brutally interrupted by a threat neither had fully anticipated, one they had allowed themselves to believe was neutralized when in reality it had only been waiting for. Because a criminal organization could be dismantled through a coordinated operation that resulted in the arrests of leadership and senior members. Its structure could be broken in ways that made it impossible to continue operating as a cohesive network. But personal revenge by individual members who escaped prison, those who had managed to flee before the network closed, who had their own resources and personal motivation that transcended organizational loyalty, had no expiration timeline or need for hierarchical approval. The morning after that emotional Thursday night brought a message that changed everything again, forcing the realization that security was an illusion and that choosing to stay together meant facing not only social and professional consequences, but resurgent physical danger. The message didn't arrive through a compromised phone that would have been recognized and reported, nor through an obvious channel that security protocols would have detected. It was obtained through a method that demonstrated worrying sophistication and intimate knowledge of their location. A physical photograph, printed on high-quality glossy paper, slipped under their front door at night while they both slept, she exhausted from crying and emotional confrontation. Jake keeping vigil beside her until they both collapsed into a sleep that was more exhaustion than rest. Jake found it in the morning when he left his room to make coffee, a white envelope with no markings except for a photograph inside. The contents made his blood run cold. Instantly, a picture showing her and him through a bedroom window where they had had a devastating conversation the previous night, taken from an angle that suggested a position near trees or the roof of a neighboring house, quality that suggested professional equipment, not a phone camera. No words accompanied the message, no explicit threat, just an image proving beyond doubt that someone had been there, observing their most private and vulnerable moment, capable of harming them if they had chosen, but instead deciding to send a message that clearly stated, "We know where you are. We saw you at your most vulnerable moment. We could have acted, but we chose to let you live, knowing how exposed you are." Jake processed the implications in seconds of training, developed over 2 decades, Not all members of the organization were arrested. Those who escaped in, there were always some who were clever enough, or connected enough, or simply lucky enough to escape even a well-coordinated network had not forgotten or forgiven. Witnesses who had caused the dismantling of their operation, and sheriffs who had exposed corruption protecting the organization, were natural targets for retaliation. And their consolidation in a fixed public location, no longer hidden away in a remote cabin, surrounded by miles of forest, no longer under the active protection of guards and security systems, but attempting to resume normal life in a rented house, in a residential neighborhood where neighbors could observe and strangers could approach without suspicion, made them vulnerable in ways that previous isolation had not. The house had windows that weren't bulletproof, neighbors who weren't checked on, a predictable routine, zero security measures beyond standard locks that a child could force. They had become easy targets because they believed the danger had passed when leadership was arrested, assuming that the remaining members would have more pressing priorities than revenge. "We need to move," Jake said immediately when she emerged from the room minutes later, showing a photograph without preamble because there was no gentle way to reveal it. "Now, immediately. This location is completely compromised. Whoever took this knew exactly where we were, had close enough access for a quality photograph, chose to text instead of acting, which means they are either planning something more elaborate or trying to force us to move precipitously to an even more vulnerable location. Where do we go?" she asked, the familiar terror that had begun to recede during weeks of apparent safety returning in full force, turning the morning relief after emotional reconnection into renewed fear. "We can't go back to cabin. The location is in all the investigation records now. Anyone with access to case files knows where it is. We can't use official safe houses because you don't have authorization, and because they've already proven that you could compromise those. And I won't let you put yourself at risk again for me. It's not your choice to do it alone," Jake replied firmly, leaving no room for argument, echoing the previous night's conversation about making decisions together, not unilaterally. "The threat is real. It's directed specifically at both of us, you as a witness, me as the person who exposed their corruption, and we're going to deal with it together exactly as we agreed. Not separately, not with you trying to protect me by removing yourself. Together." It was an immediate test of the transformation they had agreed to the night before, shift in dynamics from unilaterally keeping the protected safe to partners, collaboratively confronting threats, pooling resources and skills, and making decisions as a team, not a hierarchy. And she, despite the renewed terror the photograph provoked, despite the instinct screaming to flee alone so as not to put Jake in further danger, forced herself to nod in agreement. "Together," he repeated, a word that cost him something but was a truth he chose, even when it was difficult. "So what do we do? Where do we go that isn't on record and that we can defend if necessary?" Jake was already considering the limited options available to him. A contact in a neighboring town who owed him a favor and owned rural property not publicly connected to him. A motel in a remote area where they could pay cash and use false names. Or a riskier but potentially safer option, confronting the threat directly by contacting Wright, a federal investigator who had helped dismantle the organization, and requesting official protection, even if it dramatically complicated Jake's situation. "Let's go to my contact property for today, establish a basic perimeter, then contact Wright," Jake decided, choosing a combination of immediate security and a long-term solution. This will complicate the investigation into MIT, will add a layer of why is he still involved with a witness, but the alternative is trying to deal with a professional threat alone without resources. And that's suicide. They packed quickly, not only her essentials already in her backpack from the aborted escape attempt, but Jake's belongings as well. Documents, weapons he had kept, even after his suspension, basic supplies. Within 30 minutes they were in Jake's car, driving through indirect routes that avoided predictable patterns, both constantly checking if they were being followed. And in that car, driving through a morning that should have been about processing emotional reconnection, but was instead about physical survival once again. They both confronted reality. Choosing to stay together meant not only navigating the social consequences of a controversial relationship or the professional impact of ongoing investigation. It meant facing real and tangible danger from people who wanted them both dead, who had demonstrated the ability to locate them, who had shown through photography that they could reach them in their most vulnerable moments. But the crucial difference this time versus all previous times was that they weren't facing each other as protector and protected, as an officer doing their job and a witness being passively protected. They were facing each other as partners who had consciously chosen each other even knowing the cost, who had agreed that a future together, however uncertain and dangerous, was worth more than safety apart. Comment below. This makes sense to me when you finally reconnect emotionally and agree to face the future together. And the world immediately reminds you that danger doesn't respect emotional timing. That choosing each other means facing threats as partners, not as protector and protected. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a specific moral conflict that comes from having sacrificed everything for principal career badge, reputation, and then discovering that sacrifice didn't permanently solve the problem but only bought temporary time. That danger resurfaces, demanding impossible choices again, but this time without the resources or authority he had before, forcing him to question whether the original heroism was effective or just a costly gesture that delayed the inevitable while destroying the foundation he would need to adequately protect when the threat returned. For Jake, that conflict became impossible to ignore as he drove through indirect routes, trying to establish if they were being followed, his mind processing not only immediate tactics, but the larger implications of the situation he had created through choices he made months ago. Jake faced a dilemma that was both tactical and existential, concerning both immediate survival and the meaning of the sacrifices he had made. He had dramatically limited resources without the badge he usually carried, without the official authority that opened doors and commanded respect, without access to the systems that law enforcement depended on databases to check records, secure communication networks to coordinate with other officers, specialized equipment maintained by departments. He could not access official systems without raising flags that would reveal he was operating outside of his appropriate scope during suspension, that he was involved in a security situation when investigators had explicitly recommended he maintain an appropriate distance from her while an investigation into his actions was underway. He could not request backup from colleagues without explaining why he was still with her, why they had been photographed together in their shared home, why their relationship continued when he had implied it was a temporary complication born of circumstance, not a sustained choice. And now the threat that had believed in had needed to believe in to justify the cost of the choices it made was neutralized through the dismantling of the organization, and was resurfacing in ways that proved that exposing corruption had not eliminated all dangers but only dispersed them. That individual members with revenge motivations had the capacity to operate independently of organizational structure. Part of him, the part that had been trained over 22 years to evaluate decisions objectively, to learn from mistakes, to recognize when an approach was failing, was constantly questioning, in an insatiable loop, whether he should have followed protocol from the start, whether his heroism in violating rules to protect her in unauthorized ways had truly saved her, or if it had merely delayed her inevitable career, while destroying what he would need to adequately protect her when not if, but when the threat returned. Because if he had followed protocol, if he had trusted the system even when the system was failing, at least he would still have his badge now. He would still have resources. He would still have the authority to mobilize appropriate protection. Perhaps she would have suffered more in the short term. Perhaps her family would have been exposed for a period. But eventually, the investigation would have exposed corruption through appropriate channels, and resolution would have come with his career intact, with his ability to adequately protect, preserved. Instead, He had chosen a heroic path that seemed morally necessary at the time, but whose end result was him suspended, her still in danger, both vulnerable in ways that protocol would have prevented. He had sacrificed himself on the altar of doing the right thing, only to discover that sacrifice bought time, not safety. That the problem he tried to solve through dramatic action was more complex than individual heroism could resolve. It was tempting, seductive, even in moments of doubt, to rationalize that he had failed, that his choices had been mistakes born of ego or emotional attachment that compromised judgment, that he would have served her better by following rules even when those rules seemed inadequate. The temptation to reinterpret history through a lens of regret, to decide that investigators questioning his motivations were right, that their relationship was a complication, not a strength. But then I looked at her sitting in the passenger seat, compulsively checking mirrors, processing her own fear but not falling apart, not trying to run away to protect him as she had planned the night before, but consciously choosing to stay and face the threat alongside him as a partner. And I knew for sure that she transcended doubt and that she fundamentally did not regret it. A badge was metal, an object that carried meaning as a symbol of authority and professional identity, but which was ultimately just a thing. An item that could be taken off or returned, that didn't define its human value or ability to make a difference. A career was work. Important, yes, a source of purpose, sustenance, and structure for life. But work was something that didn't define who one was. One could eventually find a new path even if law enforcement was closed to them. But she was a person who loved in ways that went beyond gratitude or attraction or any superficial feeling. She was a person who had revealed to him a possibility of life where identity wasn't just work, where human connections mattered as much as professional accomplishments, where vulnerability and partnership had a value that distinction never offered. It was a choice that wasn't easy or convenient, but it was real, it was conscious, it was based on knowing who she was in moments of maximum stress when character is revealed, not performance. And if facing a residual threat now, without the official authorization he had before, without the resources the department provided, meant risking what little remained of his career, because contacting Right for Protection would reveal that he was involved when he shouldn't be, adding a layer of complication to an already precarious investigation, then that was what he would do without real hesitation. Because the alternative was intolerable in ways that cut deeper than practical considerations. Following rules, maintaining the appropriate distance recommended by investigators, protecting the remaining fragment of her career while she faced danger alone or with the protection of others who didn't know her as he did, who wouldn't have the personal investment to keep her not only alive but emotionally whole. He had learned through months of protecting her that safety wasn't just about preventing physical death. It was about preserving humanity, about maintaining connections that made life worth living, about protecting not only the body but the psyche, relationships, and sense of self that trauma tried to destroy. And he could do that in ways the system never could, because the system saw her as a witness, as a case, as a problem to be managed. He saw her as someone he loved, as a partner, as the reason sacrifice had meaning. "You're questioning," she said quietly, breaking a silence that had lasted miles of driving. Not a question, but an observation. An acknowledgement that she knew his thought patterns well enough to read when he was processing deep doubt. "Did I do the right thing?" Jake admitted, because honesty was the foundation their relationship had to be built on if it was going to survive. "Did the choices I made months ago really protect you? Or did they just delay the problem while destroying resources you'd need when the problem returned? Was heroism effective, or just a costly gesture that satisfied ego but failed to fundamentally solve the problem?" "You saved me," she replied with a conviction that admitted no doubt. "Multiple times. Not just physically, but emotionally. The system failed, Jake, repeatedly, to assassination attempts under official protection. A supposedly secure phone compromised. a leak that allowed the organization to track my family. You didn't violate protocol out of ego. You violated it because protocol was failing fatally." She paused while processing her own thoughts. "And yes, the threat has returned. But it has returned to us together, as partners, not to me alone. Being protected by strangers who don't care whether I live or die, beyond being just a statistic. I'd rather face danger with you without resources than face it alone with all the resources of a system that has proven inadequate." It was the validation Jake needed to hear, but it didn't completely resolve the conflict, because the tactical reality remained. They were vulnerable. Resources were limited. The threat was real and sophisticated. And the decision he had to make, now contact Wright and request official protection, risking further complicating the investigation, or try to handle it alone with limited resources, risking both their lives, didn't have a clearly right answer. "I'm going to contact Wright," he finally decided, choosing a path that prioritized immediate security over long-term professional consequences. "It's going to complicate things. Investigators will ask why I'm still involved, why the relationship continues. It will add evidence that judgment was compromised from the start. But the alternative is trying to protect yourself alone against an adversary who has already proven capable of locating us. And that's arrogance I can't justify." It was a choice that acknowledged her own limitations, that prioritized herself over ego, that demonstrated that lessons from previous months had been learned, that solitary heroism was less effective than collaboration, even when collaboration cost her pride. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a specific transformation that happens in a relationship when the dynamic fundamentally shifts from unilaterally protecting and keeping the protected safe to genuine partners collaboratively confronting threats. When both people stop performing the roles that circumstances are regionally assigned and begin to operate from an authenticity that reveals who they really are under pressure. When vulnerability ceases to be a hidden weakness and becomes a shared strength that deepens connection instead of threatening it. For Jake and her, that transformation happened during the days following the discovery of the photograph. During a period when they had to navigate not only resurgent danger, but also their own shifting identities within the relationship. During the days following that morning, when the photograph revealed that the threat had not ended, but was merely waiting. As they moved to a safer temporary location, Jake's contacts rural property, located 40 miles from town, isolated by acres of land that made undetected approach difficult, while Jake established basic defenses without the official resources he usually had, while navigating the resurgent threat and the simultaneous need to contact Wright for proper protection. Their relationship deepened and transformed in ways that were crucial, not only for immediate survival, but for the long-term viability of being together. She completely stopped trying to protect him through emotional distance or through plans to leave that had characterized the previous week. She recognized that attempting to remove her to save him was not only ineffective because danger didn't disappear with her absence, because Jake would choose to engage independently, but was also fundamentally disrespectful of his agency, of his right to choose his own path, even when that path included risk and sacrifice. Instead, she began actively protecting alongside him, contributing to shared safety rather than just passively protecting him, while waiting for him to solve everything and carrying the guilt of causing problems. She used skills she had developed over years as a nurse, medical knowledge to prepare a trauma kit that could handle various injuries if the situation escalated to violence, the ability to remain calm under pressure that she had honed in the ER during emergencies, and the systematic thinking about contingencies that the medical profession demanded. She worked with Jake to establish safety protocols that were practical, not theoretical. Multiple property evacuation routes, communication signals if they were separated, a system of responsibilities where both had a clear role instead of Jake doing everything while she waited. Not because she had illusions of being as tactically capable as he was after 2 decades in law enforcement, but because Two people working together were more effective than one person carrying everything, while another passively watched. And crucially, she offered not only practical input, but also the emotional support Jake needed, but rarely asked for. When Jake was clearly processing doubts about choices he had made, when she saw expressions of self-questioning that she recognized from her own experiences with guilt, she initiated conversations that allowed him to articulate his fears instead of carrying them. Silently, "You're questioning again. What are you thinking?" Not accusatory, but curious, creating space for vulnerability. And Jake, reciprocally, stopped carrying everything alone, maintaining a facade of a protector who was always in control, never doubting, fearing, or needing support. He began to share fears and uncertainties in ways he never had with anyone, not because he was weak, but because true trust required mutual vulnerability, because genuine partnership couldn't exist if one person performed in vulnerability while the other showed need. "I'm afraid I failed you," he admitted one night when they were establishing a security perimeter around the property. "That my heroism months ago was an ego-satisfying gesture that didn't fundamentally solve the problem. That bought time but destroyed resources I would need to protect you properly now. That if I had followed protocol, you would be safer. And I'm afraid," she replied with equal honesty, "that I'm not strong enough to be the partner you need, that I'll break under pressure and become a liability instead of an asset. But being afraid doesn't mean our choice to be together is wrong. It means that choice costs something, that it matters enough to be frightening." These were conversations that deepened the connection by revealing the complete humanity of both, not idealized versions, but real people with doubts, fears, and insecurities who coexisted with strength, commitment, and love. They were true partners. At last, not in the performative sense of declaring equality, but in the functional sense of operating with mutual recognition that both brought value, both had vulnerabilities, and both consciously chose to invest in the relationship even when it was difficult. Without a rigid hierarchy of protector always strong and protected always vulnerable, but with fluidity where Jake could be vulnerable when needed, and she could be strong when circumstances demanded. Where roles changed based on need, not fixed identity, where asking for help was not an admission of weakness but a recognition of humanity. And that partnership, that shared vulnerability that paradoxically created a strength greater than the sum of its parts, revealed a fundamental truth that they both needed to confirm. Their love was not the product of a trauma bond where the intensity of danger created an attachment that could not survive the absence of threat. It was not based on need where she needed protection and he needed purpose, and mutual dependence was confused with love. It was a conscious choice that survived both danger and peace, both extraordinary circumstances and attempts at normalcy. Both moments when she desperately needed protection and moments when she tried to leave to save him. Proving that feelings were not just gratitude or dependence, but love that persisted even when it would have been easier to leave. When Wright finally arrived 3 days after Jake contacted him, when they reviewed the situation with brutal honesty, photograph, resurgent threat, need for more robust protection, the federal investigator processed not only tactics, but the dynamic between Jake and her that was obvious through how they interacted, how they completed each other's thoughts, how they operated as a cohesive unit. "This complicates the investigation into you," Wright said to Jake directly. "Continued relationship when we recommend distance. Continued involvement with a security situation. When it's suspended, it will add evidence that judgment was compromised from the start, that actions were not purely professional." "I know," Jake replied without hesitation. "And that doesn't change my mind. She's in danger. The danger is real, and verified through photographs. And I'm going to be involved in keeping her safe regardless of how it complicates my situation, because there's no alternative." "It's not just his decision," she added, her voice firm. "It's our decision. As partners, I choose to be with him, he chooses to be with me, and we face the consequences together. If the investigation wants to characterize this as compromise, let it. It doesn't change the reality that the system failed repeatedly, and that Jake did what was necessary when protocol was inadequate. Wright studied them both for a moment, then nodded slowly. I'll arrange appropriate protection. Dedicated team, secure location, coordination with other agencies to locate remaining members of the organization. But I need complete honesty from both of them, about the relationship, about the timeline, about everything. Because if I'm going to defend this, I need to understand it completely. And in the days that followed, while official protection was established, while remaining members of the organization were systematically located through an operation that Wright coordinated, Jake and she told the complete story with honesty that did not attempt to minimize complications or present a sanitized version that would be more palatable. It's about how their relationship began during protection, how the line between professional and personal was gradually crossed, and then definitively. How love grew, not despite the circumstance, but through it, revealing the character of both. How the choices Jake made were motivated by both love and duty, and how that mixed motivation did not invalidate the moral correctness of actions when protocol was failing. Wright, processing everything with professional skepticism, but also with recognition that there were cases where humanity appropriately transcended protocol, eventually concluded, the investigation will continue. I can't make it disappear, but I will testify honestly about systemic failures that preceded their actions, about the corruption they exposed, about the positive outcome, despite questionable methods. What investigators ultimately decide is not controllable, but at least they will have complete context. It was the best outcome. Jake had hoped for not exoneration, but fairness, not approval, but understanding. And more important than career implications, Wright's validation confirmed what she and Jake already knew: their relationship, however complicated and born of problematic circumstances, had genuine value that transcended external judgment. It was real, not because it was convenient, but because it was consciously chosen through multiple opportunities to retreat where they both chose to stay. Comment below. This makes sense to me. When a relationship transforms from protected to genuine partners, sharing vulnerability and strength, when both consciously choose each other through danger and peace, it proves that love is not a trauma bond, but a real choice. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a fundamental difference between neutralizing an immediate threat that forces people together through the need for survival and navigating a complex aftermath. When danger passes, but the consequences of choices made during the crisis remain. When you have to rebuild lives that were completely interrupted and fragmented. When love born and strengthened through extraordinary circumstances has to prove itself sustainable in a normality that neither knows how to navigate because they never experienced it together. For Jake and her, that transition began when the final threat was neutralized, but proved to be a much longer and more complicated journey than victory over physical danger had been. The residual threat from organization members who had escaped initial imprisonment was neutralized, not through Jake operating alone in the solitary heroism that had characterized previous months, but through a collaborative approach that demonstrated how much the dynamic between him and her had changed. It was she who contacted Wright directly, not asking Jake's permission first, not waiting for him to solve the problem, but acting as a partner with equal agency, taking initiative when she recognized that the situation required resources that Jake alone did not have. Wright, a federal investigator who had worked with Jake to expose the original corruption and who had seen firsthand how deeply infiltrated the organization was, immediately recognized that residual members of the organization posed a threat not only to her as a witness, but to the integrity of the entire case they had built. If they could eliminate her before she could testify, months of work would crumble, and others involved in the money laundering operation could escape justice due to a lack of verifiable evidence. So, this time, they arranged for appropriate official protection, not improvised or compromised, as previous attempts had been. but coordinated across multiple agencies with adequate oversight, with dedicated staff who had been carefully vetted, with a secure location that was not on public records and that had been established specifically for their situation, and through an operation that took 2 weeks of intensive work. The final members of the organization who had escaped were systematically located, some through financial tracking that revealed fund movements, others through informants who were persuaded to cooperate in exchange for deals, one through the foolish mistake of returning to a familiar area where he was identified and arrested. The threat that had resurfaced so dramatically through a photograph slipped under the door was eliminated, not permanently, because there was always the possibility of future retaliation, but sufficiently that a relatively normal life was possible again. But neutralizing physical danger didn't mean resolving the complications that had accumulated. Jake still faced a formal investigation into his actions, which hadn't disappeared just because the final result was positive. In fact, his continued involvement, even after his suspension, his relationship with her that had persisted against recommendations to keep his distance, his choice to put her in contact with Wright instead of letting the system handle it all. Of that added layers of complexity that investigators would have to process. She still faced months or potentially years of testimony in multiple trials, not only about the original execution she had witnessed, but about subsequent threats, about corruption the operation had exposed, about organization members who had been arrested in different waves. Each testimony would be reliving trauma, would be cross-examination by defense lawyers trying to discredit her, would be public scrutiny of choices she had made, including her relationship with Jake. Their relationship, although having survived her attempt to leave to save him and a resurgent threat that could have permanently separated them, still had to navigate a much more mundane but equally challenging reality. Rebuilding individual lives that had been completely disrupted by months of crisis, discovering who they were as people outside of survival mode, proving to a harshly judged world that their love was real and sustainable, not just a product of trauma, need, and extraordinary circumstance. Jake faced not only the eventual conclusion of the investigation, which could result in anything from complete exoneration to formal termination, depending on how investigators weighed protocol violations against exposed corruption and lives saved, but also the reconstruction of an identity that was no longer just sheriff or law enforcement officer. At 43, he had to contemplate a future where the career that had defined him for 22 years might be permanently closed, where he would have to find new purpose and direction. And he had to do all that while navigating a relationship with her that was now public and subject to scrutiny, which brought not only joy but complication, which demanded vulnerability and emotional openness from him that decades of training himself to be a strong protector had made difficult. He had to learn to be not only a partner during crises, but a partner during normalcy, during mundane moments of paying bills and discussing where to live and negotiating. Differences that emerged when adrenaline wasn't masking potential incompatibilities. She faced not only testimonies but also a return to her nursing career, which she had paused, and the rebuilding of a life that had been completely disrupted. The hospital where she had worked had filled her position after months of absence, so she would need to find a new job, possibly in a new city. Friendships she had cultivated before the crisis had atrophied through months of no contact. The apartment she had lived in had been sublet. Essentially, she would have to start over in many ways. And she had to do this while navigating a relationship with Jake, whom she loved deeply, but knew primarily through contexts of protection and danger, whom she had seen in moments of extreme stress, but never in normal routine. She had to discover if the man who was a hero during crisis was also a compatible partner during peace, if the connection that seemed so deep and undeniable under pressure translated into a sustainable partnership when the pressure eased. In the first few months after the threat was neutralized, those issues remained largely theoretical because both were still processing recent trauma. still in a transitional mode where danger had passed, but normalcy had not fully returned. They were living in a temporary location provided by witness protection. Jake was busy with investigations and meetings with his lawyer. She was busy preparing for initial testimonies. But slowly, gradually, as weeks turned into months, reality began to set in. They would have to make concrete choices about the future, not just as an abstract couple, but as practical people with needs, limitations, and potential incompatibilities. Where would they live? His city, where Jake had roots, but where she would always be seen as a witness who caused problems, or a new city where they could both start fresh but without a support system? How would they support themselves financially if Jake didn't return to law enforcement while she established a new position? How would they navigate emerging differences, him being naturally reserved and private while she processed things through conversation, him being meticulous about structure while she was more spontaneous? Small incompatibilities that seemed insignificant during a crisis, but accumulated in daily life. And there was external scrutiny that was constant and exhausting, media that remained interested in the story, the community that had strong opinions about Jake and their relationship, his colleagues, some of whom supported him but others clearly disapproved, an extended family on both sides who had concerns about the sustainability of a relationship born from trauma. Emily, her sister, who had been briefly under protection and was now back in Seattle trying to resume her own normalcy, expressed concerns in a phone call 3 months after the final threat was neutralized. "I love you and respect your choices, but I want you to be sure that this isn't gratitude mistaken for love. It's not attachment born of dependency. Jake saved you, protected you." This creates a dynamic that's hard to separate from real love, and I don't want you to wake up 5 years from now and realize you stayed for the wrong reasons. And Jake faced a similar version of a former mentor who had been sheriff before him. "You sacrificed your career for her. That's noble if it's a conscious choice based on real love. But if it's attachment born of heroism, of needing to be a savior, that's a bad foundation for a relationship. And I don't want you to destroy the life you've built for something that won't last." These were concerns that both had entertained in private moments of doubt, questions that didn't have easy answers, because how do you distinguish real love from trauma bonding when the relationship was literally born out of trauma? How do you know that the choice to be together is based on genuine compatibility versus a mutual need that would disappear when normality fully returned? There is no way to definitively prove it except through time. Through choosing to stay and work through incompatibilities, when it would have been easier to end up leave and rationalize that they tried but it didn't work. Through building a life together, not despite complications, but including them. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a specific revelation that comes not during a dramatic moment of crisis when emotions are running high and choices seem clear, but during slow months of rebuilding, when you have to wake up each day and consciously choose a partner, not because necessity forces proximity, but because you genuinely want that person in your life, even when it's complicated, even when it would be easier to leave, even when the world constantly questions whether love is real or an illusion born of circumstance. For Jake and her, that revelation came gradually over 6 months after the final threat was neutralized. 6 months that tested their relationship in ways that danger never had before. Because there is a devastating difference. A difference that cuts to the very essence of what love means and costs. Between trying to unilaterally leave to save someone from the consequences of having loved. A decision that seems noble superficially but completely negates the agency of the person they are trying to protect. Who assumes they know better than they do, what they need, unconsciously choosing to stay and face impossible consequences together. Recognizing that true partnership means making difficult choices collaboratively. Not making decisions for someone based on calculations that exclude their voice. She had calculated, with a logic that seemed flawless in the solitude of nights. Processing guilt, that removing herself completely from Jake's life would give him the chance he deserved to rebuild his career without the burden of her as an anchor, without the complications of a relationship born in problematic circumstances, without her constant presence reminding him of everything he had sacrificed. It was cruel mathematics, where her absence equated to his future, where love was measured by the willingness to disappear. But Jake understood a fundamental truth that her guilt had completely obscured. She wasn't a burden weighing down his life, but the reason why his life had meaning that transcended badge and career. She wasn't the end of everything he had built, but the beginning of finally understanding what life could be beyond work, authority, and professional identity that had consumed everything. She wasn't a complication destroying his existence, but a person giving profound meaning to the sacrifice he made, transforming it from loss into an investment in a future worth more than a badge. And when she tried to leave quietly that Thursday night, when she thought she could contain her tears enough that they wouldn't be heard through the wall, when she believed she could execute the plan without emotional confrontation, Jake appeared, not because his badge required him to protect a designated witness, not because protocol dictated responsibility, but because after months of living in close proximity, he had developed a sensitivity to her specific pain that completely transcended professional duty, because he couldn't ignore when she was suffering, even when giving her space would have been easier or more appropriate, because she recognized at that moment that sometimes the strongest person, the person who has survived so much through impressive resilience, needs to be gently but firmly prevented from making misguided sacrifices, born of logic, distorted by trauma and guilt. Needs to hear a truth she doesn't want to believe, that their value transcends perceived burden, that their presence is a gift, not punishment, that love is not measured by a willingness to disappear, but by a choice to stay, even when it's difficult. The residual danger that had resurfaced so dramatically was neutralized through collaborative effort, through her taking the initiative to contact Wright, through appropriately coordinated protection, through final members of the organization being located and arrested in ways that eliminated the immediate threat, sufficiently that it was possible to breathe without constant terror again. But the real journey, the journey that would determine whether their relationship was sustainable or a pretty artifact of circumstance that would crumble under the weight of normalcy, was only just beginning when danger passed. Because now they faced navigating a formal investigation into Jake that would determine not only whether he could return to law enforcement, but whether he would face legal consequences for violations. A process that would take months with multiple interviews, reviews, and deliberations. They faced testimony that she would have to give in multiple trials over the course of a year or more. Each one reliving trauma, each one being brutal cross-examination by lawyers trying to discredit her. Each one being public scrutiny where her relationship with Jake would be used to question her credibility as a witness. They faced the task of reconstructing identities that had been completely disrupted, Jake having to discover who he was without the badge he had carried for 22 years, without the role that had structured each day. Having to find a new purpose when the career that defined him was probably over, regardless of the formal outcome of the criminal investigation, because trust was irreparably broken. She had to rebuild her career as a nurse in a new city, because returning to her previous hospital was complicated by publicity. She had to establish new friendships and routines, because old ones had atrophied through months of isolation. And she had to rediscover who she was when she wasn't in constant survival mode. And crucially, devastatingly, they faced constant testing from a skeptical, world-worried family, judging colleagues, murmuring community, speculating media that love born in crisis. Love that seemed so profound and undeniable when the stakes were life or death, could not only survive but genuinely thrive when the crisis passed and the mundane reality of paying bills, negotiating differences, and building routine replaced adrenaline and intensity. Why discover you love someone when you're in desperate danger and need protection that only they can offer? When extraordinary circumstances accelerate intimacy and create an intensity that normal life rarely allows. When the choice is between accepting offered love or facing terror alone, that's relatively straightforward, even if it's profound. Need, gratitude, and forced closeness create an attachment that feels like love, and that might be love, but it's impossible to fully verify while the circumstances that created it persist. But to consciously choose that same love, when protection is no longer necessary because danger has passed. When one could reasonably leave and rationalize that they tried, but circumstances changed. When choice requires not dramatic heroism, but the tedious daily work of facing external judgment and practical consequences and rebuilding, that is less cinematic than survival, but equally or more challenging. That reveals truth. It reveals whether love was real and sustainable, or whether it was convenient and circumstantial. Whether it was based on genuine compatibility or on mutual need that would disappear when that need eased. And Jake and she, entering those 6 months after the final threat was neutralized. We're about to discover the answer, not through dramatic epiphany, but through the accumulation of thousands of small choices. Waking up each morning and choosing a partner even when they had argued the night before. Navigating differences in communication and habits and values that emerged when they weren't operating in survival mode. Enduring scrutiny and judgment from others, without letting external pressure destroy what they had built. They were about to discover if the promise Jake made in that bathroom months ago, when she was falling apart, "You're not alone. Not as long as I breathe," was something they could both keep. Not only during crisis, but during the mundane process of rebuilding. If the connection forged an absolute vulnerability, translated into a partnership in life that was less dramatic, but demanded equal or greater commitment, and the journey wouldn't be easy or linear, or without devastating moments of doubt, where both would question whether they should continue. But it would be real, it would be honest, and it would be the ultimate test of whether what they had was love that would last, or attachment that would crumble when the circumstances that created it finally, completely evaporated. If you've made it this far with me, if you've felt every second of this journey, where the person who was always strong decided that the greatest act of love was to disappear, where guilt transformed into the conviction that leaving would save the loved one, where Jake appeared exactly when she was breaking and revealed a truth that changed everything, that she wasn't a burden but a reason, not an end but a beginning, not a complication but meaning, then you know that this story is about something much deeper than romance born in crisis. It's about recognizing that true love isn't about making decisions for someone to protect them, but about making impossible choices together. It's about understanding that sometimes the strongest person needs to be prevented from making misguided sacrifices born from logic, distorted by trauma. It's about discovering that the real test of a relationship isn't surviving danger, but consciously choosing to stay through mundane reconstruction when it would be easier to leave. And look, if this kind of story resonates with you, if you want to continue exploring these journeys where people confront the devastating difference between trying to leave to save someone and choosing to stay and face the consequences together, where love born in crisis has to prove itself sustainable when the crisis passes and normality returns with all its complications, then signing up here is the way to continue walking with me. Because I create each script thinking of you. Someone who understands that the deepest connections are revealed not only when they survive danger, but when they survive the even more difficult test of building a life together through 1,000 small daily choices. When they have to wake up each morning and choose a partner, not out of necessity or force, but because they genuinely want that person, even when it's complicated. Comment below. I'm with you until the end, because I want to know that you're here. That her attempt to leave to save him resonated with you. That you recognized that moment when Jake heard crying through the wall, and appeared not because he had to protect her but because he couldn't ignore her pain. That you understood that sometimes love means preventing someone from making a sacrifice that seems noble but completely negates agency. Your comments tell me that it's worth investing in exploring the nuances of how guilt can distort love into the conviction that absence is present. how real partnership requires mutual vulnerability, not a hierarchy of protector, always strong, and protected, always vulnerable. How a relationship born from trauma has to be tested in normality to discover if it was real or convenient. And if this touched you in some way, if you've ever tried to leave to protect someone and were prevented from doing so. If someone showed up when you were breaking down in privacy, and their presence changed everything. If you understood that choosing to stay through mundane reconstruction, when the crisis passes, is a harder test than surviving danger together leave. So I know. It's not about numbers. It's about knowing that what I create reaches you on the other side and touches something real. Something that makes you think about your own attempts at misguided sacrifice. About people who prevented you from leaving when distorted logic said it was necessary. About the difference between love that is convenient during a crisis and love that is consciously chosen when the crisis passes. And because I know you don't want this story to end here. Because stories like this demand continuation. Demand to see if Jake and she navigate investigation and testimonies and reconstruction of identities. If their love survives not only danger, but the mundanity of paying bills and negotiating differences that emerge when adrenaline isn't masking incompatibilities. If they prove to a skeptical world that a connection forged in absolute vulnerability translates into a sustainable partnership. There's a video here that continues in the same vein. Click and follow me there. Their journey of discovering if love born in crisis thrives in peace is only beginning. Our journey together continues too. Until the next chapter.